Casualties of War is a haunting war drama directed by Brian De Palma, starring Michael J. Fox as Private Sven Eriksson and Sean Penn as Sergeant Tony Messerv. Based on the true account written by Daniel Lang in The New Yorker, the film tells the story of an idealistic young soldier in Vietnam who faces a terrible moral crisis after witnessing a horrific crime committed by his fellow soldiers. The flickering neon lights of the subway cast a sickly glow across the car. The metal floor rumbled beneath tired feet. Amid the blur of passengers, a middle-aged man sat silently, his eyes fixed on his own reflection in the window. But he wasn't really looking at the glass. He was staring into something far deeper. Memories, ones that refused to fade. His name is Eriksson, a veteran. But something inside him had shattered long ago. When his gaze met that of a young Asian girl seated across the aisle, the shadows of his past surged forward. As the train slipped into a dark tunnel, his mind did the same, sliding back in time. To 1966, Vietnam. A squad of American soldiers weaves its way through a dense tropical jungle, their rifles at the ready. At the front is their leader, Sergeant Tony Messerv. That day, they were assigned what seemed like a routine mission: sweep through an area suspected of being a Viet Cong route. They entered a Vietnamese village, Gia Han. The soldiers moved through the noisy settlement like they'd done it a dozen times before. They didn't mingle, but they didn't seem like a threat either. It was as if they were wandering the streets of Los Angeles, not the front lines of a war. They are young soldiers who are still vulnerable, unstable, emotional, and careless. Also not so much experience, not alert and vigilant at all. They feel like they are heroes of their country, when in fact they are just raw children who still need a lot of discipline when on duty. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. From somewhere unseen, bullets rained down. The squad dove to the ground. Brownie was hit in the neck. Messerv returned fire while pressing against Brownie's wound. Eriksson did the same. The attackers' Viet Cong guerrillas hidden in underground tunnels were aided by local villagers. After a short but deadly exchange, the jungle fell quiet. The enemies had vanished. Brownie was medevaced by helicopter. But he didn't survive. Something shifted in Eriksson that day, not just because he nearly died, but because of what he saw in Messerv's eyes. It wasn't just the rage of war, it was a hunger. A need for vengeance that had found no target. After days trekking through thick jungle and sticky marshes, the squad arrived at Base Camp Wolf. This wasn't the clean, organized outpost seen in recruitment posters. It was a scar on the earth, a mess of sagging tents and makeshift bunkers. The air reeked of wet earth, gunpowder, sweat, and cigarettes. Soon, Messerv's squad received a new mission: to push into Tra-Kick Hill, deep in Valley 209. Their orders were clear open the trail, locate enemy tunnels, but do not engage unless fired upon. But Messerv had other plans. Still burning from Brownie's death, he twisted the mission into something personal. He told his men they were free to shoot anyone they deemed an enemy. And worse, he devised a chilling plan. They would return to Gia Han and kidnap a girl, a local, as a companion for their journey. Eriksson was horrified. At first, he thought Messerv was joking, but Diaz supported the plan, and the pressure mounted. That night, madness took hold. They returned to Gia Han. A place that should have been a battlefield now became a crime scene. The soldiers searched hut after hut, until under Messerv's command, they dragged a young girl owned from her home. Eriksson watched in horror. The terror on her face was a mirror of the dread rising in him. This wasn't war. This was a nightmare. He tried to speak out, to protest, but his voice was lost. Peer pressure, fear of defying a sergeant, and the looming threat of retribution silenced him. The image of the young girl being carried off while her family wept in helplessness was soul-crushing. No one dared stop them. No villager, No elder, no sibling. They were all held hostage by fear. Owen was taken, an innocent, far from the reach of justice. In Messer's eyes, she was Viet Cong, an enemy, and thus fair game. To Erickson, she was just a girl, a human being. Forced to carry gear and walk barefoot, Owen was dragged along as they moved deeper into the wilderness. In a forgotten corner of the jungle, they found an abandoned tent. She was ordered to clean it. Then the unthinkable happened. In that remote shelter, humanity was erased. Erickson tried to intervene, tried to stop them, but he was met with threats, pistols drawn, slurs hurled. He was faced with a terrible question. Was he willing to die for a girl he didn't know? In the end, he failed. He did nothing. And in that silence, the evil was unleashed. Owen was raped, again and again, by the men he once called brothers in arms. Erickson, frozen by fear and shame, witnessed it all. Every scream, every sob etched itself into his soul. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a prisoner of his own conscience. The torrential rain poured down on the Vietnamese jungle, breaking the night's silence with a brutal, relentless rhythm. Every drop felt like a cold whip, soaking Erickson's uniform. Yet it was nothing compared to the chilling fear creeping within him. The torches that had once glowed now flickered desperately, almost extinguished by the storm, creating terrifying shadows that danced on the tree trunks. The scent of wet earth and leaves was replaced by the rank smell of fear. Erickson stood frozen in the chaos, his eyes fixated on the helpless figure of Owen. Every whimper that escaped the girl's lips, every desperate twitch of her powerless body, felt like a dagger piercing Erickson's heart. The next day, the squad, minus Clark, who stayed to guard Owen, descended into enemy territory. Near a railway and river, Messer spotted movement, Viet Cong preparing for something. The opportunity was perfect. He sent Hector and Erickson back to fetch ammunition. At the hut, Clark mumbled that he, too, wanted to be part of the fight. Seeing a chance, Erickson convinced him. Clark, arrogant and oblivious, agreed, leaving Erickson alone with Owen. This was it. Haunted and broken, Erickson tried to save her. Owen crouched in the corner of the decrepit hut, her body trembling, her eyes staring blankly into emptiness. The marks of the previous night's brutality were still clearly visible on her face, etching an indescribable pain. Erickson approached slowly, each step filled with caution, as if afraid of shattering the fragility that enveloped the girl. He knew he had to approach this very carefully, needing to rebuild the trust that had been completely shattered. Erickson sighed heavily, realizing just how deep the wounds were from what he'd witnessed last night. This wasn't going to be easy. He had to find a way to reach her before it was too late. Clark and Hector soon returned. Messer, suspecting Erickson's intent, had sent them back. Erickson continued to try to persuade Owen while preparing everything. He kept trying softly to build her trust. "I won't hurt you. I want to help you. We have to go now, before they come back." He glanced towards the hill where Messer and his team were lurking. Another threat, one that could erase this chance. When they are trying hardly to run out the tent, unfortunately, just as expected, Clark caught sight of Erickson trying to take Owen away. Erickson flinched, trapped. His hopes shattered into 1,000 pieces in an instant. He turned, looking at Clark, but no words came out. Clark, with an iron grip, made sure Erickson wasn't going anywhere. The escape had failed. Then, Clark pointed his gun and forced them up the hill. They were forced back up the hill, back into hell. Tension escalated on the hill as they faced the Viet Cong soldiers. Messer also found himself in a position where he had to eliminate the Vietnamese girl so she wouldn't compromise their attack. For Messer and his men, this was the final step to erase their tracks, to ensure their crime would remain hidden. A fierce conflict erupted among them. Messer then forced Diaz to kill the girl. Erickson pleaded with Diaz not to do it, but Diaz was conflicted until Erickson fired his weapon, revealing their position to the Vietnamese guerrillas. They were then met with machine gun fire from down by the river. Clark managed to wound Owen. This was a last-ditch effort to erase the traces before other Americans arrived, as they had called for Central Command to ensure their horrific crimes would never be exposed. Owen stood there, between them, small and fragile, yet at the center of the conflict that was about to explode. She trembled, her eyes darting from one face to another. Erickson stood, but Messer was faster. Messer shouted at Clark to immediately execute Owen. Immediately Clark shot Owen and made him fall from the cliff, before finally the American helicopter came and dropped the Vietnamese guerrillas. When he finally made it back to base, he was no longer the same Sven Erickson who had arrived in Vietnam. His eyes were now filled with horror, his soul wounded. The trauma of the events would haunt him like a shadow, changing his view of war, of humanity, and of himself. He was a survivor, yes, but also a victim. A victim of atrocities that came not just from the enemy, but from fellow soldiers. And from that wound, from the burning rage within him, emerged an unwavering resolve. He would seek justice for Owen and for the last vestiges of his own humanity. With a burning resolve, Erickson began a struggle harder than any physical battle, the fight for justice. He tried to report the atrocities he'd witnessed to military authorities. However, he soon realized that truth was a rare commodity on the battlefield. He faced a thick wall of bureaucracy, skepticism from superiors who preferred to cover up shameful incidents rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Threats from Messer's comrades, who sought to silence him, were a daily reality. They mocked him, intimidated him, even threatened his life. "It's war, Erickson," they might have said. "Forget about it. Everyone does bad things here." But for Erickson, this wasn't just bad things. This was an unforgivable crime, a transgression too great to ignore. He was alone, fighting the system and fighting the very people who should have been his allies. Yet Owen's suffering and the guilt, gnawing at his soul, gave him the strength to press on. He wouldn't give up, not until the truth was revealed. Erickson finally got the chance to meet the most capable person in their unit, Captain Hill. Captain Hill had already heard the rumors. News of the Owen incident, and especially about Erickson being too inquisitive. The captain's face was sour. "This situation is complicated enough without you causing further chaos. You're too persistent, Erickson, and it's starting to disrupt unit stability." He paused for a moment, staring sharply into Erickson's eyes as if issuing a warning. "Given your uncooperative attitude, and for everyone's good, I think it's best to transfer you out of this unit." Erickson's eyes were filled with deep disappointment. His hopes shattered into pieces. He had believed in the system, in justice, but now he was confronted with the bitter reality that the military institution preferred to cover up its corruption rather than face uncomfortable truths. Erickson headed towards the secluded latrine, his mind still reeling from Captain Hill's dismissal and the veiled threats from Messer's men. Just as he was inside the dilapidated stall, the night's darkness was suddenly shattered by a rough rustling sound outside. Before he could react, the short, horrifying clink of a pin being pulled was distinctly audible. Erickson's heart dropped. A grenade. They wanted to kill him, and they wouldn't stop. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, he rose. He had to fight back. In the corner of the latrine, he grabbed the only hard object he could use as a weapon. A rusty, worn-out shovel that was somehow there. They wouldn't get away with this. Erickson sat alone at a bright bar table, a full beer can in his hand, sipping slowly. Suddenly, a soft voice broke his reverie. "Your mind seems heavy, son." Erickson looked up. A military chaplain. After some brief pleasantries, the chaplain finally looked at Erickson with a gaze full of conviction. "Soldier, he said, his voice low but firm. What you experienced and witnessed is a crime, and it must be accounted for. Ericsson's journey finally found its light. Owen's body was discovered. Thanks to his persistence and the unexpected help from the army chaplain, Owen's case began to move forward. The information Ericsson provided, initially ignored and even met with hostility, now garnered attention from higher authorities. One by one, the soldiers involved in the heinous crime were called for interrogation. These one-by-one interrogations not only revealed the truth, but also highlighted the psychological complexities of war and how humans can be pushed to the lowest points of humanity. Messerv and his men, seated in the defendants' chairs, were a torment in themselves. Messerv, with his audacity and arrogance, attempted to deny, twisting the facts. Justice for Owen was finally served. The truth had been revealed, and the perpetrators would pay dearly for their actions. Diaz was sentenced to 16 years in prison, Hatcher to 20 years, while Clark and Messerv received life sentences. However, for Ericsson, this was not the end of his suffering. The wound in his soul would never fully heal. This verdict was merely the close of a horrifying chapter, an acknowledgement that a crime had indeed occurred. He had fought and won, not on the battlefield, but on the moral ground. Ericsson returned home, but the world he knew felt foreign, and the war he left behind followed him. Owen's face, her voice, the betrayal, all of it clung to him like a second skin. He was one of the casualties of war,